Hi, I'm Mark Doty. Here's what a Juno-6 sounds like when I do it. You're looking at the oscillator and LFO of the Roland Juno-6. And you'll notice right off the bat that this says DCO, which is something you haven't commonly seen in many of my videos, if any. But yes, the Juno-6 has a DCO, and what this is an oscillator whose frequency is constantly checked and controlled by a computer. Now, my understanding is that this oscillator is close to an analog oscillator whose pitch is controlled by a computer, so that it's forced into a digital tuning, which means it stays in tune, which if you've used any analog synthesizers, you know that that's kind of an issue for some people. And it certainly was an issue at the time when this was made, so everyone was very excited about DCOs because they stayed in tune. Sometimes people describe them as sterile, but really that's another factor of the tone. And these days, with the popularity of this synthesizer, that factor of the tone is actually sought after. So we're going to dig right into this. I have this set to the sawtooth wave. So this is the sawtooth wave of the oscillator of the Roland Juno-6. You might notice that this is polyphonic. You knew that, but still. I'm going to switch the octave down. We have an octave control over here in the control area, which we'll cover later, but I want you to hear the full range. And of course, we have a setting that is up, which goes very high. Your dog is whining in sadness about that? Okay. And I should point out that the envelope is set to gate and there's no chorus happening, so you're just hearing the oscillators. Let's listen to the square wave. Listen to the low square wave. Let's listen to the high square wave. You can hear it robbing there because it is a 6-voice synthesizer and I may have played more than 6 voices. I'm sorry. I just got excited. I can't control myself. Okay, we're not going to talk about the bender. Okay. So that's the square wave. But hey, wouldn't it be cool if you could manipulate the pulse width of the square wave and thereby change its timbre? Well, as a matter of fact, you can with the pulse wave modulation setting. Let's listen. You are changing the width of the square wave and thereby changing the timbre. And this setting, and some pulse width modulations, you can actually make the square wave disappear when you get to a 100% setting. But this one stops before that, so you get a playable range, the entire width of the pulse width modulation. And that sounds great. It's kind of cool with the precision of these oscillators. The sound of them beating against each other is different than in a polyphonic synthesizer with VCOs, but it has this grindy, pleasant aspect to it. Okay, now wouldn't it be cool if we had the opportunity to change the pulse width, let's say modulate the pulse wave, something like this. That'd be really awesome, but it's impossible. Okay, I'm totally lying. It's totally possible. Here is the switch. We'll switch this to LFO. At that point, the LFO controls the LFO modulates the pulse width. Our LFO here is actually changing the width of the pulse wave, the square wave, changing the pulse width of the square wave over time. As you can see, it's a triangle wave that's doing it. We have the ability to change the rate. Now, this is traditionally what they did on synthesizers when they wanted to say, I'm sorry, it's only one oscillator, but we can almost fake two oscillators beating against each other by changing the pulse width. And we came to just love it for what sound it is. That's pretty cool. I actually like it slow. Let's see if we have another setting here for the pulse width modulation, and that is, and this is cool, to switch it to envelope, which means then the envelope controls the pulse width of the square wave. And we're not talking about the envelope yet, but we'll kind of have a preview here. Right now, the envelope is controlling the pulse width of the square wave. So changing the envelope will change that control. So you can get a lot of different effects using the envelope to control the pulse width. That way you're actually getting like an attack transient that's slightly different because of what's happening with the pulse width. There's kind of a stutter start there. So there's a lot to play with. When you're just in the simple fact that the envelope controls the pulse width, you have a lot of opportunities for interesting timbres. Or you can go back to manual, or use the LFO at any rate you'd like. And you can give it a really high rate and then have a low amount. And it adds some thickness to it. Or while you're playing in real time, you can adjust how much the LFO is affecting the pulse width. Don't forget that you don't have to have something else do all your work for you. You can use your hand to do it. Okay, so obviously our square wave on the DCO of the Juno-6 is pretty awesome. We also have a sub. That's a sub-oscillator, which we can't hear even though I've just pressed a key because the volume is low. This is a divide down situation where the oscillator's output is divided in half to get an octave lower. And it's usually used in combination with one of the other oscillators. Like here we'll do the square wave. Here is the square wave without the sub-oscillator. Here's the sub-oscillator. So it adds in an octave lower than what we're actually playing, which allows you to really fill in the bass of the synthesizer. And playing chords too. I mean, wow. Those chords really beef up quickly when you've got all of those same notes playing an octave lower. You're playing a much larger chord. You're actually playing two octaves of the same chord, so it really fills out. And then if you change the pulse width of the square wave oscillator, the sub-oscillator stays a square wave, and then you get a different pulse width on the non-sub-oscillator, which causes some interesting effects. That is a really rich sound. There's a lot going on there. And yeah, I'm saying that about a DCO. That is a really rich sound. This is why people like this synthesizer. Gosh, that's so crunchy. I can't even believe it. So what? There, we've taken off the LFO, and now we just have manual. Listen to that richness. That's really cool. But the sub offers you an octave lower and a doubling of whatever you're doing. And you don't have to have it full on. You can be more subtle than that. And that's pretty awesome. Let me remind you that, well, and also here's a cool thing about the sub-oscillator. You can choose in advance where you want the setting to be when you turn it on. So that's really convenient. It's not just all of a sudden on, you know. Well, I mean, it is all of a sudden on, but it's all of a sudden on in the place that you've set it to. There's also noise. Let's listen to the noise. Since it's polyphonic, the more notes you play, the more noise you get. Woo! Noise. Okay. Obviously, the noise can be mixed in with your other signals to get different timbres. Just by adding noise to the sawtooth wave, we're getting a richer sawtooth wave sound. And you can add the sub-oscillator with the sawtooth, by the way. And you can add the sub-oscillator to the sawtooth. Wow. Wow, that is a big sound. And you can also have the square wave on. You can have all of them on. Here we go. Here it comes. Someday I'll play a chord other than D. With all of those waveforms going at the same time, and the sub-oscillator and pulse width modulation, you get a really full sound. And no, we're not using the chorus yet. We'll put the chorus on last. You don't need the chorus. Just enjoy these great waveforms. Let's talk a little bit about the LFO here. I've covered all these things here, so let's talk quickly about the LFO. If you have the LFO set, the trigger mode of the LFO set to auto, that means when you turn up the LFO of a given thing, it's going to do its LFO thing. Listen. I have turned up the LFO on the oscillator, and now we hear the LFO affecting the DCO with a triangle wave. Of course, we can control the rate by adjusting the rate on the LFO. And if you're going to go this route and you don't want to be pressing any buttons, which I'll talk about in a minute, you can set a delay time so that the LFO doesn't happen right off the bat. So you hear there at first, there's no LFO. And then the LFO comes in, which is a lot of fun. So if you transfer between chords without lifting your fingers up, you're not going to re-trigger the LFO, so it'll continue to happen. But if you release, you'll re-trigger the next time. So that's a way that the LFO can be used to control the DCO. Another way is a way we'll cover in a minute when you switch it to manual, and then there's no LFO until you press the LFO trigger button over here. And then it will go through the delay time and then start, but you can turn the delay time down and then just use the LFO trigger button. So yeah, but we'll cover this section over here more in a bit. But those things are basically the DCO and the LFO for the Juno-6.